and by Paul Scully, the Conservative MP for Sutton and Cheam. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with the news that the 51-year-old radical preacher Anjem Choudary was released this week, having served half of his 5.5-year sentence for inviting support for the Islamic State group. What threat does his release pose, and what are the implications for the Met's fight against terror? Jerry Thomas reports.
It's understood that the Met have put in place up to 20 measures to control the East London preacher Anjem Choudary. His assets have been frozen, meaning he will be subject to extremely strict financial controls, which typically mean that any attempt to open a bank account or move money will alert the authorities. Choudary will stay in a probation hostel for up to the first 6 months of his licence, which continues until July 2021. He will be subject to licence conditions including a ban from preaching at or attending certain mosques. He will only be allowed to associate with people who have been approved by the authorities. He will be allowed one phone and is banned from using an internet-enabled device without permission. Use of the internet will be supervised, and he will not be able to leave the UK without permission from his probation officer. However, former Met terror chief Richard Walton has said that Choudary was a hardened, dangerous terrorist and someone who had had a huge influence on Islamist extremism in this country. However, a new counter-terrorism bill, which is currently with the House of Lords, should make it easier to prosecute below the existing threshold for incitement to commit terrorism.
Well, I'm joined now by the Chief Executive of the counter-extremism organisation, the Quilliam Foundation, Haras Rafiq. Thank you for joining us. Should Choudary still be considered a risk?
Well, Choudary absolutely is a risk. I remember about 13, 14 years ago, he was regarded by many as a pantomime villain, a bit of a clown on the fringes, but really it turned out to be the Pied Piper of Islamist terrorism. He's somebody who has had direct links with at least 15 terror plots in the UK, and hundreds of people have been inspired by him to go out and join ISIS in Iraq and Syria. He is a threat, he's not been de-radicalised, and he's shown no sign of remorse or rehabilitation. So
do you think that's the key factor, his influence on others as opposed to him as an individual?
Well, he believes in the ideology and the theology. He is what we would call somebody who's a believer and espouser of Salafi jihadism. He believes in that. And obviously in the UK, to have certain views in a liberal secular democracy, it's not illegal. We don't have the thought police. He's somebody who's been very, very clever until 2.5 years ago, stayed just on the right side of the law, but has been very, very vocal and very active in getting other people to do things. We know that from Curran Butt, the leader of the London Bridge attacks and the killers of drummer Lee Rigby. So he's definitely been somebody who has inspired people rather than carrying out attacks himself.
We heard in the film about some of the restrictions which are going to be imposed on him when he's released. In your view, do they go far enough?
Well, these are probably the strictest restrictions ever placed on somebody out on licence, and we've got to really trust our agencies to be able to do their job. What worries me is in the age of narratives, it's no longer about counter messages or messages, it's all about stories. There will be two competing narratives which will have a symbiotic relationship between each other. The populace that will turn around and say, look, the British government can't keep him in prison, they have to let him out, etc., etc., etc. And then we've got his supporters who will turn around and say, look, the British government is impotent, it's powerless to do anything. He will act, even though he won't be directly inspiring others, his narratives, the two competing narratives, will actually be used as recruiting agents by his supporters and by populists.
And Karen, does that worry you?
I think it understandably would worry anybody. I mean, he's an odious man and he has absolutely odious views. And it was very good, and I think a tribute to the police and intelligence services, that he was prosecuted and that he did serve his sentence. You know, that is the law has been effective in this. Now, it is not, I don't think, for politicians to try and second-guess all of the conditions that have been set on the licence. We know that they're extremely onerous. We know that it will be a very comprehensive multi-agency approach to setting those conditions, and a considerable amount of money and effort will be gone into enforcing that, and that's absolutely right and proper.
Yeah, absolutely, because that multi-agency approach we're talking about, Paul, it's going to cost £2 million, we're told, to operate that surveillance. Why not keep him in prison?
Well, we have a justice system, we have a process, and that's what has to be followed through. We, as Karen says, we can't second guess it, and it's difficult to start making exceptions. We've gone through this with controlled orders in other areas, which are controversial in themselves. But Karen's right, we've got to trust the services to do their job.
But in these sorts of cases, is this something the government should be looking at? Should we be reviewing this so that people like Choudary could be kept in prison?
Yeah, and I think the counter-terrorism bill does start to do that process, but we absolutely need to keep all of these things in review because, frankly, terrorism, extremism changes all the time for the reasons that Haras said.
There are specific powers in the counter-terrorism bill that will allow for an extended sentence rather than the automatic half sentence. So that is one of the things that is going to be introduced, and the Labour Party voted third reading of that and supported it.
In your view, are we still losing the hearts and minds of young British Muslim people to men like Choudary?
We are, and I'll tell you why. There hasn't been... So I've been involved in this now since 2005, involved in the task force after 7/7 and then been doing this for a long time now. What I've seen along the way in the last 13 years is a political inconsistency and the desire to actually see things through. So, for example, we had the prevent strategy, the PVE strategy, and that initially was about hearts and minds.
And of course, that's been very controversial.
Well, it depends who you listen to. If you listen to the prevent lobby, yes. But if you listen to the hundreds of people that have actually been rehabilitated, if you listen to the families, the children of some of these people and the parents of some of these people, it's actually working, and it has worked. However, what we haven't done effectively, especially in between 2008 and 2015, we lost the focus on the hearts and minds. We started to look at the prevent strategy purely through the lens of securitisation. After 2015, we did see the reintroduction of a counter-extremism strategy, but there was a lot of damage done in those 5 years, and we didn't focus.
And would you be concerned that the sort of surveillance, the expense that we're talking about with the release of someone like Choudary, is that going to be drawing further resources away from the kind of projects you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it takes on average 20 to 24 people to monitor somebody 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that does take resources away. That's £2 million, up to £2 million that it will cost, that could be spent on something else. That worries me. But what worries me even more is that I'm actually pleased, I'm actually okay with us talking about him, talking about his ideology, talking about the threat. And he still is a dangerous man, a dangerous individual. But we must learn some lessons. One of the worst things that we did since he came on the scene was we empowered him. The media, all of us, we empowered him to actually have a platform. Half the people that are recruited were vulnerable. The other half wouldn't have known about him if they hadn't seen him actually pulling his stunts on mainstream media. We need to be very careful because his licence will finish at 2021.
OK, and on that note, thank you very much for joining us.